All right, guys, we're going to read chapter 12 today of Cracker, the Best Dog in Vietnam by Cynthia Kadohata. And the other day, when we read at the end of chapter 11, we know that Rick and Cracker and all the guys had just arrived in Vietnam, and I showed you the picture of the example of what the caskets with draped in flags look like on the tarmac, which would be the landing strip for the airplanes. And Rick was kind of offended at first that the guys that were just landing in Vietnam would let them see that. He thought that would be kind of intimidating for the guys. But U-Haul his sergeant was just like, look, he got kind of upset with him, and Rick felt like he could be a little bit disrespectful to U-Haul because he's like, what are they going to do, ship me off to Vietnam? But U-Haul didn't back down. He got right back in his face and told him and made him get off the plane. And now we're kind of talking about what happens once they get there. So the 67th Infantry Platoon Scout Dog loaded up the trucks for the convoy to Bien Hoa. This is it. Rick and Cracker were about to become the best scout dog team in Vietnam. Rick gaped as the convoy rode through Saigon. He'd never seen such chaos. Men dressed in what looked like black pajamas, exactly the kind the enemy supposedly wore, rode bicycles so rickety, Rick would have thought they'd disintegrate under the weight of the riders. The bicycles darted among the army trucks and the women balancing fruit, one basket hanging on each end of some kind of a stick that the women carried on their backs. Market owners and customers waved their arms and shouted. Rick assumed they were bartering. This is like bargaining, trying to get you to buy something from them, these open markets. He could smell fish, but he couldn't see any. Kids ran barefoot alongside the truck, screaming, G.I. Joe! He was surprised at how many Americans walked or rode through the streets. Rick and the rest of the squad sat in the back of a truck, covered with their ponchos, their dogs huddled by their sides. The old-timers laughed and talked, but Rick just said over and over to himself, I'm here. The air smelled different, like, well, he guessed the only thing in the world it smelled like was Saigon. He just hadn't expected it to smell so different in a different country. Sure, every place on the planet had different trees and fruit, people and roads, and so on. He hadn't expected that a collection of trees, fruit, people, and roads would seem like a completely different planet. The temperature was in the 90s that day, but because of the rain, Rick wasn't even sure whether he was sweating. He wiped water from his eyes and kept gaping. As the convoy left Saigon, the guys quieted down. Rick peered at every shadow for Viet Cong hiding along the road. Jungle loomed around them, palms and elephant grass and trees so thick you couldn't see past the first layer. Mud splattered on their faces and filled every crevice in the road and every bomb crater in the field. Rick's heart skipped a beat as a few old-timers suddenly pointed their rifles toward something, and then Rick saw a couple of young crying kids run out of the jungle and away down the long road they'd just left behind. The convoy ran through a village. Nobody spoke. It was as if they'd all realized at once that they were an open target. Anyone could be hiding anywhere and fire on them. The civilian hooches were roofed with straw, and most were small, probably only one room. There was no concrete anywhere, just some tin and yellow thatch and the green jungle that was everywhere. Cracker was pressed between Rick and Tristy. Feels like Disneyland, don't it? A talkative black guy nicknamed Uppy finally said. He was an old-timer, just 23 years old, but on his second tour of duty. His real name was Upton. He was one of the few old-timers who didn't make fun of the new guys. He was a shortish guy, looked like he could deadlift about 500 pounds. Yeah, Rick said, except you don't get killed in Disneyland. Not that he'd ever been to Disneyland. Now he was a lot farther from home than California. Rick didn't see any other trucks, but he did see more men in those black pajamas riding bicycles. A couple of beautiful Vietnamese girls stood by watching Rick's truck work its way through the mud. Uppy leaned over and waved at the girls. Xin chao, girls, he called out. Then one of the girls looked straight at Rick and said, I like you. You number one. He stared after her. Dang, she was choice. Then he heard laughter from Uppy and a couple of the other seasoned soldiers who were hitching a ride in their truck. Uppy leaned out of the truck and shouted at the girl, "Hey, how about liking me?" Cracker's head shot up. She smelled something important. Chickens. She saw chickens under a house and barked wildly, setting off a round of barking among all the dogs. The handlers pulled their leashes tight, and 24 voices called out at once, "No!" Cracker gazed back longingly at the truck as the truck drove past. Those were perfectly good chickens. She looked at Rick and tried to explain. "Wolf!" Rick just shook his head. He waited for Sarge to yell at them to control their dogs, but for some reason he didn't. As they left the village area, nothing but jungle surrounded them. Sarge's face took on falcon-like features as he peered into the jungle. "Any Viet Cong around here?" Rick called out. Sarge shook his head. "None reported, but that doesn't mean they're not here. We always say they're everywhere and nowhere." The convoy passed what looked like a destroyed village, a few half-standing huts in the rain, before turning down a winding road. After a few more hours of driving, Rick saw some sorry-looking buildings in the distance. "That's Ben Hoa?" he asked, disappointed. Several times today, Cracker had heard the word Benoit. "We've been temporarily reassigned," was all Sarge said. "This used to be a temporary FSB, but they're using it now for the 271st Airborne. We'll be supporting their ground infantry. There's been a lot of contact here lately." Rick wasn't going to ask what the heck an FSB was, but he wished somebody else would. Finally, he whispered to 2020, "What's FSB?" 2020 whispered back, "Fire Support Base. Temporary camp they set up that sometimes becomes permanent." When Rick's truck arrived at camp, he was even more disappointed. Even Cody seemed less than his usual jovial self. Camp was basically a flat, muddy plain with a bunch of ugly buildings and about 10,000 packed sandbags lying against them. Literally about 10,000. Rick already knew exactly who was going to fill the sandbags around their hooch. The trucks moved through the gates and stopped in front of the big empty space. The dogs and handlers got off while Sarge talked to a major who'd approached the convoy. Rick liked watching the Sarge kowtow to somebody else. The Sarge walked over to where the men waited. He swept his hand toward the empty space. "Meet your new home, gentlemen." And guys, kowtow means kind of bow and be respectful. Rick and 2020 glanced at each other, and finally Cody asked, "Where are the barracks, Sergeant?" The old-timers burst out laughing. "Man, oh man," said one. "You gotta love new guys. Hey, if anyone is looking for the Holiday Inn, it's right over there." Then he and his buddies laughed again and walked off. "We're going to build barracks," said Sergeant. "That is, if we get the materials. In the meantime, we'll use the tents." Rick asked, "Sarge, does that mean that there are no dog kennels either?" "Ditto on the kennels, except for now, we'll use the crates." Rick watched Sarge look the platoon over. Naturally, Sarge's eyes stopped on him. "Lansky, you could start filling sandbags. Cody, you and Mason set up the tents." Rick didn't listen to the rest. This was just great. His very first assignment in Vietnam was filling stinking sandbags. One of the old guys took pity on him and handed him a shovel so he wouldn't have to use his E-tool, the entrenching tool the men all carried. Rick stuck his shovel in the ground and lifted a load of dirt. All right, this wasn't so bad. The second one wasn't bad either. But by the time he'd finished just a few bags, his palms had already grown raw. He looked out around the fire base at all the sandbags. On the upside, there were worse assignments. A couple of the guys had been assigned to clean out the latrines. Once in a while, someone would walk by and he'd hear them say, "New guys." Blisters bubbled up on his palms. Technically, these weren't sandbags. They were dirt bags. And right now, the dirt was actually mud. As Rick filled the bags, someone else piled them around their tents and the dogs' crates. But you could pile them only so high. A mortar attack from above could kill them. Someone had lined the crates up together, and Rick could see rain slanting into the crates. Rick wasn't supposed to, but he and some of the other guys, also assigned to filling sandbags, let their dogs off leash while they worked. Rick spied an old-timer walking by and called out, "Say, man." The guy stopped. "Yeah?" "Are there any extra tarps around? Our dogs are going to get soaked while they're trying to sleep tonight." That is, if night ever came. The time change made Rick's head groggy. He squinted at the bright sky. "What you got to trade?" "Oh, come on. We're all in the same army." The guy shook his head and said, what Rick knew he was going to say. New guy. Cody walked over. I got a watch, he said. Rick looked at Cody with surprise. That watch was his pride and joy. The old-timer leaned over to steady the watch. He tried to appear nonchalant, which means cool, guys. But Rick could see his eyes lighten up. Cody pulled it off his wrist. That's solid gold, Cody told him. My grandfather won it playing poker. The old-timer said, I seen better. Rick knew a little about bargaining. Even with prices stuck to the items in the hardware store, sometimes people tried to negotiate. Now he looked nonchalant and said, forget it. We'll find someone else to trade with. The old-timer scratched his cheek. I tell you what, I'm going to do you a favor because you're new. We'll also want some steaks for dinner tonight, Rick said. That watch is worth a lot of money. I'll talk to Mike, the old-timer said. Who's Mike? You don't know Mike? Mike's the most important guy in camp. You got to know Mike. He's just a Spec 4, but he's more important than a general as far as you're concerned. A general don't care if your dogs get wet, and a general ain't going to get you no tarp or no steak. But we call Mike our procurement specialist. So later that day, the dogs had their tarps stretched out on poles over their crates. Mike had the only thing of value Cody had ever owned, and the guys and their dogs ate steak for dinner. Cody was just about the most popular guy in Vietnam that night. Rain poured for several days, and after a while, you accepted it, just like it was regular air. You walked through it like it was nothing. The dogs weren't as effective in the rain because it washed away the smells, but Cody got called out on a mission anyway to take a chopper to a drier area. Rick spent most of the first 4 days filling sandbags or mud bags. He gloved his hands to protect the blisters and attacked the mud and felt the opposite of relaxation. He felt in the shop at home, working with his dad's tools. He felt frustrated out here. And guys, that word procurement up there, procurement specialist, what they call this guy, Mike, that means getting things, getting your hands on things. Like if you want something, if you procure it, that means getting a hold of it. Like I procure things now by ordering from Amazon. Since Cody had already gotten chosen to go out on a mission, it didn't seem fair that Rick was filling these dang sandbags. What kind of high-tech helicopter war was this anyway? Then, on the 5th day, the skies cleared. During formation, Sarge yelled out to him, Hansky, you got to search and destroy. Tomorrow? Now, mister. The crazy thing was that even though Rick had been wanting his chance to whip the world, he now realized that this was a lot safer filling sandbags. Still, he couldn't wait to show off Cracker. As was customary with new handlers, one of the short handlers would accompany him. Short meant a soldier who had only a short time left in country, so they were called short or short-timers. By tradition, the short-timers worked mostly in the rear, which meant jobs as far from combat as possible. They'd already turned in their dogs, so the dogs could learn to work and bond with new handlers. Some handlers thought giving up their dogs was one of the hardest parts of their job. Rick didn't like to think about it. The mission was to make contact in an area where a reconnaissance team had said Charlie might be hiding. Rick had heard that the team had reported some fresh bark scraped from a tree. Didn't sound like much of a lead to him, and probably didn't sound like much of a lead to anybody, because the brass, which means the high-ranking officials, was sending out only a couple of small platoons. Rick waited at the makeshift kennels while the short-timer sat with his former dog, a pure black German shepherd, talking to him. At one point, the short-timer leaned his head into his dog's coat. Rick turned away. It seemed like a private moment. He patted Cracker's head. We got a long way to go before I'm short. Finally, the other handler left his dog, and they walked to the helicopter pad. They had just one cigarette between them, so they shared it. I guess you had a good dog? He's the best dog in Vietnam. Name's Mike. He's one of the first dogs in country. Yeah, I noticed he's got white on his chin. Another handler's taking over, and then they'll probably retire Mike. You going to take him home eventually? They won't let me. What happens when they retire a dog? The man looked into the distance and shook his head. I don't know what's going to happen to him. Then the pilots began arriving, and Rick, the short-timer, and Cracker hopped on a Huey. The short-timer sat with his legs hanging out the doorway. All the doors were taken off the choppers for faster loading and unloading. Rick had liked the chopper during training, but now, in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the thought that this could be his last ride. There were 5 birds altogether, so this wasn't a big mission. He looked at Cracker, her face full of joy as the wind blew back her ears. Cracker loved being on the helicopter. The wind pounding her face filled her with life. She was ready for anything. The choppers landed 10 minutes later, and the men leaped off. Rick counted about 40 men. Everyone looked pretty relaxed. The commanding officer told Rick to head due east. Rick began walking point with Cracker and the other handler. Cracker didn't like the other guy walking so close to them. A couple of times she growled at him, but then she felt the harness jerk, and she heard Rick snap, "No." So she put up with the other guy. She kept looking back at Rick to see if she was going to be let off leash, but Rick never gave any indication. The whole day they walked and walked and walked and walked through light brush. She didn't smell anything special except the body odor of the guy walking next to Rick. Then she smelled gunpowder and pricked up her ears. The smell kind of twirled around in the air with the wind. She looked back at Rick, and he said, "Search." She walked more and then heard the whistle of the wind passing over string. She sat down. "What you got, girl?" "She's got something," said Rick. He didn't move forward. He'd learned his lesson well back in Georgia. He, the other handler, and Cracker fell back while one of the men checked out and then fired at the booby trap, setting it off. Cracker didn't even flinch at the explosion. Man, she was a great dog. Rick found he loved walking point. This is what he'd been trained for. He thought again about saving that boy's life. He could save lives today, and he felt 100% certain that Cracker wouldn't let him get killed. She found 7 other booby traps that day. He'd heard the record was more than 100, but he didn't believe it. Rick thought it had been a pretty low-key day, but when they went back to the camp, several guys from the mission nodded at him. Respect. It felt good. He snuck Cracker some extra food that night. Cracker spent the night alone in her crate. She didn't understand why some nights she had to sleep by herself in the crate, and some nights she slept outside with Rick. She liked to sleep with Rick, though she still vaguely remembered her bed with Willie. That bed was pretty comfortable. She did miss that a little, and the concrete they used to walk on was easier on her feet than these bumpy trails. On the other hand, she felt something out there in the brush today, something new that she hadn't felt even in that other place where they'd searched through the bushes. She felt like she was herself. That was strange because herself really loved lying in a soft bed. But only out there, searching for something she knew was important to Rick, and somehow also important to her, she was herself. She didn't feel ecstatic like she did when Rick was petting her and praising her. And she didn't feel excited like when he was just about to feed her. She felt like she was herself and that she was part of everything around her. It was something new. She liked it. And when she was finished for the day, she felt like she was somebody important. She knew Rick felt important too. They were important together. When Rick returned, 2020 and Cody were off on missions. He saw them less and less. They both pulled a couple of longer missions right away, and just as they got back, Rick pulled his second mission. It seemed that the handlers worked more independently than most guys. One of the short-timers said you usually didn't even know the men you were working with. Rick's second mission was a night ambush near base. He went out with a platoon of 24 men. He and Cracker cleared the first area, meaning he walked through the area in an orderly fashion, searching for booby traps or enemy mines. Cracker didn't alert a single time, and one of the guys grumbled that she isn't finding anything. But Rick knew that she didn't alert because there was nothing to alert for. That night, the platoon set up claymore mines around the perimeter of their nighttime defensive position. If any enemy soldiers approached in the night, they would be instantaneous BKs if they were lucky. If they weren't lucky, they would be dead. So that means, guys, their camp, they put these claymore mines around the outside of their camp so nobody could sneak up on them. They could sleep. Remember, I told you these claymore mines were pressure sensitive. If you at that time, if you stepped on them, when you picked your foot up off of them, then they would explode. Ambushes were often set up in graveyards because they were above the water table. That way, you didn't have to lie in the wet all night as the water from nearby swamps or rice paddies rose with the tides. So they were sitting over bones waiting for a fight. While it was still light, the men pretended to set up for the night. When darkness fell, they moved about 100 yards away to trick the VC. Rick was standing up when machine gun fire broke out and broke through the silence. He hit the dirt, then lifted his head and saw most of the guys laughing at him. A couple of other new guys also hit the dirt. But an old-timer told him, "That's an M16." And as Rick replayed the sound in his head, he realized it was an M16, meaning it was shot by a friendly. Charlie used AK-47s. The sergeant in basic training had shot one off for the guys, so Rick knew the difference. He felt like an idiot. Well, at least some of the other guys had done the same thing. As they moved camp, Rick lay still in the darkness, listening for the other guys, but not hearing them. These guys were pros. Rick had done his work for the day and didn't have to take his watch. The world seemed peaceful and the breeze almost cool. This was war? He let himself drift off. Cracker pressed up against his legs. They weren't allowed to sleep on their ponchos that night because ponchos made a rustling noise and also reflected light, so he kept his poncho rolled up in his rucksack. Some of the guys didn't even bother to bring their ponchos. Cracker stood up and pulled slightly on her leash. Rick knew she wanted off, but he felt too new to all of this to take the chance. Except for one almost cool breeze, Rick felt the temperature didn't seem to drop at all during the night. But the clouds began to clear and the stars shone through. He slept well. When morning came, the sky was completely clear for the first time since he got to Vietnam. Far in the distant plains, Rick could see a huge green cone with remnants of red cloud hovering at the tip. Above it, the sky was blue. It was a lone mountain, rising above the plains and rice paddies. He'd heard of it. Nu Ba Dien, Black Virgin Mountain, named for a woman whose fiancé had died. Up he took off his boots and peeled away long strips of skin on his feet. "Oh, man, can't you do that in private?" Huppy laughed. "Immersion foot. Wait till you'll get it. It's from wearing damp boots all the time." "I ain't getting no immersion foot," Rick said. "How you gonna stop it?" "Willpower," Rick said. Both men laughed. Rick could tell that Uppy was laughing with him. Uppy nodded toward a new guy who was taking out 5 pairs of neatly rolled socks, several pairs of boxers, and an extra shirt from his overloaded bag. The new guy picked out different clothes to put on and then stopped to swat wildly at some mosquitoes. Rick had already noticed that old-timers just waved them away or even ignored them. And he already knew that he'd rather stink and be filthy than carry extra clothes on his back. And then Rick knew he wasn't a new guy anymore. Cracker stood up and shook herself off. She could hear the choppers in the distance. In a moment, she saw everybody getting up too. Rick picked up his bag and waited. The ambush was a bust. No snipers, no VC, no nothing. He'd heard that was usually the way it went. You set up an ambush or huddled down in the bushes for hours or even for days and nothing happened. Then every so often you made contact. Some guys had been in country almost a year and had made contact only a handful of times. Other guys had had the bad luck to make contact a dozen times in 3 months. Rick wasn't sure now whether he wanted to make contact or not. So far, Vietnam just seemed like some kind of bizarro alternate universe where the leaves were as big as a man and where you never saw the enemy. He hopped on the Huey with Cracker and hung his legs out the door as they flew over the land. Cracker sat beside him, pressing against his arm. Remember, guys, they talked about the different types of rifles, and we looked at them in previous chapter, but I wanted to show you again. This is a version of what the M16 that the American soldiers used. And here's a picture of the AK-47 rifles that they were talking about that the Vietnamese used. And they did sound different. So that's how the guys got used to knowing whether it was friendly fire or not. Also, I wanted to show you, Rick was talking about seeing pictures, or not seeing pictures, but when they first landed, seeing the VC walking around. And this is not actual pictures, obviously, of the VC, but I found on a website where they recreated, this is examples of the type of quote unquote, what he called black pajamas looking outfits that he saw the Vietnamese people wearing a lot of. And he said they were dressed exactly like what he had been trained that the Viet Cong would be wearing. But they would be something like this. Some of these guys, obviously, this guy might have the right type of gun, but this guy, I don't know. He's just got Looks like he's got a black powder or some type of rifle. I don't know. But anyway, I kept his picture because he has one of the hats that is a traditional hat that they wore in Vietnam. But this guy's dressed more correctly. He's got, it looks like the right type of gun and some of the packs, and they usually had some type of a scarf around their neck. And they always usually had some sort of a hat on. But that's an example of the loose clothing that they wore. And obviously they were black because it blended in more. And this is just a little explanation of why they called the American soldiers GIs. And when it started out, I'm not going to read all this to you, but there's a lot of speculation on where the term GI came from. They said, like during World War I, there were some metal barrels that had some type of fluid in them that had a GI stamped on them that stood for galvanized iron because they had some kind of chemical in them. But that later on, a lot of people misunderstood the English language because it was in other countries. But anyway, they thought it stood for government issue or general issue. And then it said that on history.com, it said that a lot of the soldiers, thinking it stood for government issue, began to jokingly refer to themselves as GIs because they were like sarcastically saying they were government issue. So then you know how it is when something's called something, that name kind of sticks. So as the servicemen began to refer to themselves in sarcastic terms as GIs, they kind of became, because they were mass produced, it became a symbol. And there was also a cartoon by the cartoonist Dave Berger or something during the Second World War called G.I. Joe, and it became popular. So it kind of coined the term, as they say, the name of the comic strip was G.I. Joe. So that's what they started calling them in, G.I. Joes. Joe would be just a regular Joe. It's just a generic name for somebody. And so anyway, and then it said in 1964, kind of at the beginning of the Vietnam War, it was kind of popular for little boys to play, or they like to play with action figures. And so Hasbro, a popular toy company at the time, came up with, it was a competitor of Mattel, came up with a type of action figure called G.I. Joe to compete with Mattel, who had come up with the Barbie doll. So that was part of that. They talked about rice paddies, and I might have shown you this before. I can't remember, but Vietnam is very wet. A lot of the areas that the guys fought in was below the floodplain, so it was flooded really easily. And we talked about rice was grown in water. It grows in water, and they eat it just like as a side dish with every meal, just like we eat a lot of potatoes in our country. It was a staple, and it provides that same. It's a carb, provides a lot of starch, so it gives you a lot of energy. And this it comes from a time period, just like in our history, when you didn't have to worry about watching your weight. You didn't chub it up. You had a lot of manual labor, and they work hard, so they need the energy to work hard. Just as before we had all this automated things, like you had to go out and hunt and gather and farm work and do a lot, and guys that do a lot of hard and ladies that do a lot of hard manual labor, you have to have energy to get that done. So rice is grown, and these people are planting these rice plants. And I found you some pictures of the harvesting of the rice, and you see these traditional hats. They're cone shaped, but you even see the little kids, and they'll go out there and you see there's no water anymore because they drain. If it's a natural, it's harvested in the dry season because in the tropical environments you have a wet season or a rainy season and a dry season. And this is a traditional harvest. Like now they use machines, but you see him with a pack on his back where it's been cut and gathered by the handfuls. These kids are helping. He's doing it with a little sigh, they call it. And people in America used to harvest corn and wheat and hay. Back in the 1800s, they used to harvest them with a big long-handled saw, and this guy's doing it with just a handheld one. This guy's also doing it. Now, of course, they have the machines and things like that. And one thing that we'll read about and hear about, I don't know if you know what this is, but this is a leech. They're creepy looking, they're disgusting looking, but leeches, they suck blood. They attach themselves to living creatures and they suck blood. Well, they love moisture. And so they live in these rice paddies. They live in the jungle. They love moisture. But they also love warm human beings. So you'll hear a lot about them as we go through and read on in the next chapters.